Today I'm in Deventer with my girlfriend Lara, and we're here with our friends Daan F. Oostveen and Kai Shmushko. Daan is a philosopher and Kai is a cultural religion researcher, and she's from Israel, and we have been talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict all day. And this morning Daan suggested to call Alex Stein, and Alex is his friend in Israel. He's the co-editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books, and he's also a tour guide in Israel. In the first part, we are going to have a conversation with Alex, and in the second part, we try to discuss the conversation we had with Alex. Ik gewoon even... okay, Dan, you were saying...
Yeah, so if you really want to, like, if you're going to interview me on, like we're just sitting in a woonkamer and you're just going to interview me and Kai about what's going on. In the end, I don't have anything to say about Israel and Palestine. So I don't have anything to say. I don't even want to have a conversation on the whole topic, because I've started into sort of like erasing everything on my social media, because I feel that the whole situation is too explosive. So this morning I get my two best friends who ask me something about talking about Israel and Palestine. And so I have Alex apping me this morning and saying to me, like, so Alex asks me, do you know people who would be interested in learning something about Israel and Palestine? So I'm in my head, I'm like, well, Alex, this is in my head, it's not to him. I say, well, Alex, currently I don't know, like, do you want to talk to free Palestiners and then that they would be open-minded to hearing from somebody in Israel, like, who is sort of interested in this stuff. But of course, I did sort of feel sort of his appel, because he does know a lot, and he is, like, extremely eloquent, and he has a very nuanced perspective on the whole thing, and he's very open. Now, and then you asked me, Michiel, this morning, like, okay, can we do a podcast? Like, no strings attached, open. So basically, you say to me, I have an audience who want to hear about Israel and Palestine. Where the question I got from my other friend is, do you know an audience who wants to know about Israel and Palestine? So then my immediate response is, well, you say I want openness. So I say yes, because I also like openness. And then I'm also open and say, well, I also have the best source, which is Alex.
For me, it is interesting also that Dan wants Alex to the sort of on-ground person to talk, and that for you, Michiel, it's also enough in a sense to have a conversation about our experiences here in Europe, reacting to the situation in the Levant. So
for me, because I'm not an expert on this topic, not at all. But for me, in a way, I am an expert when it comes to the cultural scene in the Netherlands. And I see an oversimplification in every debate in the Netherlands when it comes to art and culture and the cultural paradigm shift. So in that sense, I'm really interested in this topic because it's just happening right now. You are from Israel. Dan is more or less interested in this when he was 14 years old already. Yeah. He's also an expert, and Alex lives there and he's also an expert. So, and for me, it's like a metaphor for how an inherently complex situation gets oversimplified by public debate in the cultural spectrum of the Netherlands or in Europe or in America. So for me, that's why I am interested in this topic. I want to get your specific knowledge to understand why the debate gets simplified.
The reason why I feel like I have something to gain from it is that I feel that I'm somewhere in the middle. So I'm like listening to the Dutch opinion. I've been for the past 6 months like busy and trying to understand what kind of discourse can be about Palestine in the Netherlands. And I'm also reflecting on it from an Israeli perspective. So that, for me, that will be quite interesting. And to be honest, it's also quite interesting that I'm from there and I'm not there currently. So I'm now reflecting it from both sides. And that's why for me, that would be quite fascinating or quite bright.
Well, maybe, Alex, can you introduce yourself to the
I
listeners?
can introduce myself. My name is Alex Stein.
I am a tour guide and educator based in Jerusalem. I'm originally from London. I moved to Israel in Zionist parlance. I made Aliyah nearly 15 years ago. And I'm also one of the co-editors of the Tel Aviv Review of Books.
We are here in Deventer. I'm here with Daan and with Kai. And actually, we've been talking for the last day to discuss the topic of what's happening in Israel right now, right? So now we have a unique opportunity, I guess, to have a view, a perspective from within. So maybe we can start here. So what's happening?
So over the last month, to give some sort of background for listeners for whom this is a new subject, one of the difficult questions is when you're asked about something that's happening in Israel and Palestine, between Israelis and the Palestinians, you're often asked, how did it all start? And that becomes a very vexed and complicated question. Depending on who you ask, someone will say, well, it started a couple of weeks ago. Someone else might say it started in 1967. Someone else might say 1948, 1929, 1921, 1881, the 7th century. So that is, first of all, one of the most complicated problems about answering any questions related to Israel and Palestine. But we can point to what's been happening, obviously, more recently. And I think the first thing to understand is Israel vaccinated its population very, very quickly. So for the last month or so, we have been more or less back to quote unquote normal. And in fact, we sort of completed this process just before the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. And Ramadan is, of course, a very important Islamic festival. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, is a very important place of pilgrimage for those who are able to get there. Okay, every year, because Israel controls access to that site, and although people coming from Arab Palestinians coming from Israel or from Jerusalem are able to come, people from the West Bank and obviously Gaza find it much more difficult. In fact, in some years, people are able to come certainly from the West Bank if they receive a permit, but very few and mostly not. And this year, not. And however, this was, of course, not just Ramadan, but it was a sort of post-pandemic Ramadan because lots of people in East Jerusalem have been getting their vaccinations. And one of the triggers for what has come to pass related to barriers that were placed at the entrance to the Old City, at a place called the Damascus Gate, which is the main entrance to the Old City for Palestinians. And there were barriers placed there by the Israeli police to stop people congregating there under the excuse or reason that it was related still to the corona restrictions, because there are still some corona restrictions, but probably because each Ramadan, those stairs, the people who mainly sit there are young men. In Arabic, you say the shabab. And there was a kind of feeling that there was a likelihood of tensions and conflict between the security forces and the people coming there. But of course, what happened was this was seen as an unreasonable restriction on Palestinian freedom of worship in the Old City. And there were big protests against it. And the Israeli police reversed course. Okay, so that's one event. But we have a number of other simultaneous events. So the next simultaneous event, I would say, is Palestinians, young Palestinian men were filming themselves. There are actually 6 videos like this, I think, on TikTok, assaulting, slapping or throwing coffee over, various other sort of degrading acts, ultra-Orthodox men, okay, in Jerusalem. Now, ultra-Orthodox men often find themselves the target when there is sort of nationalistic violence not because they are the most sort of hardcore Zionists in the city. They're not. Generally, the ultra-Orthodox population is less Zionist than the rest of the Jewish population, but because they are the weakest looking, and they're the ones you can be absolutely sure are Jews. And if you're going to sort of attack someone in Jerusalem, for example, you want to, obviously you're going to do it to someone who you think is going to have less chance of fighting you back. You're not going to attack someone who's been in the army and is going to be able to win that fight. That caused great feelings of anger and humiliation, and it led to far-right Jewish marches where people shouted things like "death to the Arabs." So that's sort of three parallels. And then the fourth mix...
Wait, Alex?
Yeah.
I have one question. You mentioned that it happened on TikTok? Oh,
TikTok, yeah. It was filmed on
Can you
TikTok.
explain that a little? So this new technology interference, how does that work?
Well, I'm not a fan of social media, but my understanding is that TikTok, you can film very short videos. It's sort of like Twitter for videos. So Palestinians film themselves beating up or various assaults on ultra-Orthodox young men, and then posted the videos on TikTok.
So it was like a bullying action to provoke a little, to poke a little with the like young people
with
do.
The technology. Exactly. And then there's one more key element which is important, although I think probably less important in terms of what has happened this week with Gaza and inside Israel, and that is in the Palestinian East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. There is a part of that neighborhood which is adjacent to a tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous. It's believed to be, even if it's not historically verified, a holy tomb of an important Jewish figure from around 2,000 years ago. And that site was originally owned by, the Jews purchased some land there in the late 19th century and lived there until 1948. In 1948, the State of Israel is created and 750,000 Palestinians are made refugees. Some of them are basically expelled from their home by Israeli forces. Some of them flee the fighting, but they're not allowed back afterwards. And that's the majority of what becomes the the refugees. But it's easily forgotten that smaller numbers of Jews in areas that were conquered by the Jordanians, i.e. in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, they were also kicked out of their home and ended up living in West Jerusalem. And after 1967, Israel took control of those areas, and organizations not necessarily connected with the original inhabitants wanted to reclaim those homes. And I'm not going to go into all of the sort of legal arguments because we'll be here until next year. But the divide between the two sides on this issue is the Palestinians see this as discrimination aimed at removing them from the city. Some call it ethnic cleansing. They point to the fact that Jews are ostensibly reclaiming land that they owned prior to 1948, but there is no such recourse available to Palestinians. Whereas Israel says this is a private legal dispute that does not have these wider nationalist implications, and is just about, these few houses in this one particular area. Again, I think the reason I don't want to go into all of the details now, partly because, as I said, it's extremely arduous, but partly because with time, although Save Sheikh Jarrah has become a very important slogan on social media and definitely among Western audiences, I don't think it was the big motivator for the actions of Hamas. And what happened earlier this week was that Hamas said all of these events led to intense clashes between the Israeli forces and Palestinians, culminating in Jerusalem Day on Monday. Was it Monday? My timing may be slightly out. It's been a crazy week, but I think it was Monday. Yes, it was definitely Monday. Where Jerusalem Day is when Israeli Jews celebrate the Israeli conquest of Jerusalem in 1967. And this is also during Ramadan. So it's an unfortunate clash of these two very charged events. And as part of the Jerusalem Day celebrations, there is a flag march by nationalist Israeli Jews to the Western Wall. And traditionally, that route passes right through the Muslim quarter. It goes in through Damascus Gate, where those barriers were removed from, and it ends up in the Western Wall. And obviously, that is somewhat of a recipe for trouble. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to understand that. But normally, Israel always insists that it goes ahead as planned. And this year, the security forces said, if it goes ahead as planned, there's going to be trouble. There's going to be big trouble. And the Israeli police initially ignored that and said, we're going to do it anyway. And then at the last moment, they changed the route. Said, we're not going to do it. Because Netanyahu said you need to change the route, but then Hamas said if Israeli forces don't leave the Temple Mount area, the Al-Aqsa area, to Jews it's the Temple Mount because it's where the holiest the Jewish temple stood until 2,000 years ago. If you do not leave the Temple Mount, we are going to launch rockets from Gaza. And the deadline was 6:00. And at 6:00, I was in the flat in Jerusalem, and there was a siren, and I was surprised. I was impressed perversely by the timing and the honesty of the threat. We went into our safe room. Now it's people being on time in the Middle East is appreciated, even in dark circumstances. Later in the week they said there's going to be a 9:00 surprise, and in Tel Aviv there were no sirens, and people were like, "Was the 9:00 surprise that there is no 9:00 surprise?" So anyway, there was a siren, and then we heard a big explosion. And that was a rocket landing about a few kilometers outside of Jerusalem.
Alex,
we were in our safe.
I understand you have, when you hear the sirens, you have 90 seconds to get into the shelter. Is that correct?
In Jerusalem. Because Gaza to Jerusalem is it's about an hour's drive by car, about 60 kilometers. So in Jerusalem, you have 90 seconds. If you're living in the area right around Gaza, I need to check the times, but it's like, I don't know, 5-10 seconds, something
15
like
seconds.
15 seconds. There you go. In other words,
what happens in those 15 seconds?
In those 15 seconds, you have to you need to get to your shelter. So in other words, when it's a time of conflict, you have to always be within 15 seconds of the shelter. Otherwise, you are potentially exposing yourself to risk.
I mean, from within.
Yeah.
Can you explain those 15 seconds psychologically? What happens in your head?
I've never ever been in the what we call Otev Aza, the Gaza envelope area. During when I've been to those places, but never when a rocket has gone off. But there's obviously a massive difference between being in Jerusalem and being just outside, being in the Gaza envelope area, and obviously most of the rockets land in that area, and that is the area that has borne the brunt on Israel's side of those rockets over the last 10-15 years. So that was the start of this round, and it's important to understand again, when do we start? When does this all go back to? But another important date is 2005. 2005, Israel withdraws, evacuates its 8,000 settlers who were living there, 8,000 Israeli Jews who had lived in various places inside the Gaza Strip, and had withdrawn its military. And after that point, Israel said, we're no longer occupying Gaza, but other figures argue Gaza is still occupied because Israel still controls the airspace, it still controls the sea, and it also controls two of the three borders. The other border is controlled by Egypt. And because it controls those border crossings, there have been times when it has been able to increase pressure on Gaza by means of using those crossings. And the important date, the follow-up date for that is 2007. Because in 2007, Hamas take over Gaza from Fatah, okay, who control the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah in the West Bank. And ever since then, the Gaza Strip has been run by Hamas, and Hamas are an Islamist organization who are historically sworn to the destruction of Israel and have been involved previously in suicide bombs and all kinds of other terroristic acts. And this was the first time that they had really controlled a piece of territory. And ever since then, there have been various, I don't like using the word, but there really isn't a better way of describing it, rounds where there is some sort of trigger, like the sort of things I've described. Hamas fire some rockets. Israel attacks with obviously a much more infinitely sophisticated array of aerial power. People, and then that's when the sort of clash really kicks in, and that's when the sort of different narratives that echo and reverberate far and wide, of course, in Europe as well, really begin to play, and that's when everyone takes their side.
Alex?
Yes.
I interrupt you for a second because I'm curious if you think it's relevant to bring in this to your trajectory. The elections, both in the Palestinian Authority and in Israel. Do you think it's relevant?
Great question. Yeah, great question. So you see, there are obviously so many different factors, and the Palestinians were due to have an election for the first time it's been postponed for something like 10, 11 years, a parliamentary election. And that was postponed on the premise that Israel isn't allowing the Palestinians to vote in East Jerusalem. But that was perhaps also an excuse because Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah party were liable perhaps to lose. Some people argue Hamas would have won. I'm not sure. Who knows? We can't be sure. And Israel, similarly, we've recently had our fourth election, and no one has been able to form a coalition. And that story becomes more relevant as the week progresses. But what's important, I think, to understand is that Gaza and the different rounds of fighting, if you like, lead to this clash of narratives and ideas on what is happening between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think I can try to sum that up succinctly, that up until the 1990s, there was this common idea that there was this national conflict between two peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and that through a process of compromise and negotiation, they would be able to come to some sort of arrangement between them. That all collapsed with the failure of the Camp David peace talks in September 2000 and the start of the second Palestinian Intifada, uprising against Israel. And ever since then, there have been two divergent narratives. I also don't like the word narratives, but again, for want of a better word, there have been two diverging narratives whereby on one side, Israelis basically concluded the Palestinians don't want to come to any arrangement with us whatsoever. Peace is not going to be possible. And then there was a divide within Israeli society between some who said we just need to sort of try and leave them alone as best we can, and others who said we need to sort of annex more, we need to take more territory, we need to take control of the West Bank, even the lands, the areas that we sort of partly ceded during the Oslo Accords. And on the other side, this idea emerged, which I think is now completely accepted and because I'm talking to a European audience, is basically with a few exceptions here and there, is basically accepted on the European left that Israel, that there is no conflict, because a conflict, according to this reading, implies two equal parties, but that in reality, Israel is a settler colonial entity, a foreign implant in the Middle East that was created, that as part of its creation displaced the Palestinians and then imposed a system of apartheid on the Palestinians that has lasted to this day. And the only way to bring peace and justice, according to this reading, is for Israel to not exist as a Jewish state and for there to be some sort of new arrangement, which is often described as a state of all its citizens or some sort of neutral state. And the corollary of this is that Israel is always responsible, and that Palestinian response is always resistance and it is always legitimate. In other words, according to this,
this is, I guess, the subject of today, the main subject, because this indeed is the narrative right now. And as I see it, this is the oversimplification of the conflict.
Yeah.
And so you started off with saying that you can analyze it on multiple levels and going back in time to the 60s, to the 40s. Yeah. If I paraphrase this correctly. Yesterday we had a very long discussion about what is called, if I remember it correctly, the 6-Day War. And Kai told me that this, and Daan told me that this was of major importance to understand the conflict, but it's not very widespread in Europe. What exactly happened there? So maybe we can, if this is the main subject, maybe it's good to explain it a little for listeners in the Netherlands.
To explain the 6-Day War, or
So why that is a major puzzle piece?
Well, I don't know. I don't think that. Well, I actually, that isn't, in terms of this reading, this isn't the major puzzle piece.
Okay, so
that's the whole point.
What is the major puzzle piece?
Right. The major puzzle piece is Zionism. The major puzzle piece is Zionism, and Zionism is first of all, when we talk about Zionism, like any other political ideology, it's historically been very diverse in terms of exactly what its political program. So let's narrow it down. Let's talk about political Zionism. Theodor Herzl, late 19th century, German speaking, lived in Vienna, also Paris and other places. And he came up with the idea of the Jewish state. And he came to the conclusion that the Jews would never be fully welcomed or integrated in Europe and would always be vulnerable to anti-Semitism. And as a result, they had to create der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, or as some people argue from the original German, should perhaps be translated a Jewish state. So there's a bit of an argument about that. And he came up with this plan to create a Jewish state. And he wasn't fixated on it being necessarily in what was then Palestine. At first, he looked for other options. He kind of tried to negotiate with various imperial powers. But eventually, the movement coalesced around creating a Jewish state in Palestine for the simple reason that is the ancient land of the Jews. And this is a very simple point, because the word Jew, Yehudi, means someone from Judea. That's what it means. So a Jew is someone from Judea. That is the literal meaning. And Judea was again, without going too much into the details of the ancient history, but Judea was a land, statelet kingdom that existed in various degrees of sovereignty in the ancient world, in what we call the biblical period and in the ancient world. Now, Herzl was not the first person to say there should be some sort of Jewish state, okay? It's also not true to say Zionism was solely an idea of Ashkenazi European Jews. There were also Sephardi Jews originally from Spain, who ended up in the Ottoman world and the wider Middle East. But Herzl was the first person to put it together. And according to the narrative that has taken hold in Europe, this was a racist enterprise aimed at displacing indigenous Arabs, and that the only way to undo the damage of that enterprise is by, as I say, setting up a theoretically neutral state where the Palestinian refugees from 1948 and their descendants, we're talking around sort of 4.5 million people, maybe probably 5 million actually, today spread in various refugee camps around the Middle East and other places around the world, will be able to return to their homes. That is the narrative.
Yeah. So as I see it, but again, I'm definitely not a specialist. It's for me, it's always very cloudy material. So, but as I see it, it's an inherently unsolvable conflict between those two groups of people claiming the same piece of land.
Right. Well, that's the thing. I mean, that might be the conclusion after. I mean, again, wherever one stands, the question is it solvable? Is it not solvable? And I would definitely suggest that the trajectories that the two sides are currently on make it incredibly unlikely that the conflict can be solved. Because if you go down this zero-sum path where you say, I don't need to compromise because I'm completely in the right, then either you win a war against the other side, which in the Palestinians can't do it because they're, obviously Israel is far superior in terms of its kind of resources, military, etc., etc. But we can't win the war either because we can't. First of all, we don't want to, despite what some people say. And even if we did want to, we obviously couldn't expel, get rid of the Palestinians. In other words, we're doomed, if you like, or you can see it as a blessing, to inhabit the same space of land. And then the question is, okay, yeah,
like in a marriage, in a way.
Well, that was actually Amos Oz said we need an amicable divorce, right? So in a divorce, you need to you sort of share you work out how to share things between you in some sort of equitable way. So that's the sort of situation. But what concerns me and why I really want to speak to as many audiences as I can, I think this zero-sum game is wrong. And I think, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess here comes my interest in this 6-day war, because for me, it's when I was young, you have all this in the Netherlands or in Europe, you have all this, there was a race of the pro-Palestinian voice. So we all know the story of the Second World War and what to do after the Second World War. We all understand that in a way, and then you have this conflict with the Palestinians. So how to solve it? Yeah. And then, but if you tell this conflict from the 60s, you can grasp a little why there was actually a solution on the table for both ends, and then you understand why. There is conflict now, and why, whereas you see all those missiles, you think, so why all this violence? And then people start posting children with burned children, so then you have all those following saying, oh, there are burned children, why they do this, why, and then you have this pro-Palestinian voice getting traction. And so I think if you say it's in a way unsolvable conflict, you have to see why it's unsolvable and what both sides try to do to reach out to each other. So that declares in a way why it's a conflict. So I guess that's why I want to know how you see this piece of the puzzle. You understand my question? Or
So the 6 Day War. So look, in the 6 Day War, Israel triples in size. It conquers the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai Desert from Egypt, and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Old City of Jerusalem from Jordan. Triples in size. It will later on return the Sinai to Egypt in a peace treaty, and in 2005 it sort of withdraws from Gaza, but it annexes East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, and the West Bank is placed under military occupation, which remains to this day. So suddenly Israel controls millions of Palestinians who don't want to be controlled by it. They want to have some sort of independence of their own. And this eventually leads to Palestinian uprisings in 1987 and then again in 2000, and ultimately to the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. But the reason why I don't think we should get so hung up on the 6 Day War, because if the problem was the 6 Day War, then it would be relatively easy to solve. In other words, Israel would withdraw from those territories, and there would be a Palestinian state set up in those territories, and that's called the two-state solution. And until very recently, that has always been the main game in town. That was what the so-called international community tried to achieve, culminating in the tragic failure at Camp David in the United States in the year 2000. But as a result, following on from that failure, people have, on the Israeli side, people have been less supportive of the idea of the Palestinian state, because the Second Intifada was characterized by a wave of suicide bombers into Israeli cities. And then you had the wave of missiles, and people said, well, it's not a very clever idea to give the Palestinians sovereignty, because they might just use it as a base to carry on fighting. And on the Palestinian side, and even more so, I think, amongst the intellectual left, Palestinian diaspora and supporters of the Palestinians in Europe and increasingly in the United States, although interestingly not necessarily elsewhere in the world, in other parts of the world. The idea was not about 1967. The idea went back to being the problem was the creation of the state of Israel. That was the big problem. And the only way for there to be peace is if you undo the original sin of Israel's creation. So that's why I don't think we should get too hung up on the question of 1967. In other words, it's a symptom of the conflict that has to be resolved, but it's not the cause. It's not the cause of the problem.
We were sitting yesterday, Alex, at a beautiful terrace in the center of Deventer, and Kai and me were explaining the sort of whole history to Michiel and Lara. And one of the questions which came up from Michiel's side, which I couldn't really completely answer, is he said, well, from my perspective, I don't see anything new, right? For me, it's all the same. It's just continuous war. And then I said something like, well, at least we can say there's a sort of a level of escalation. So how do you look at this? Is this like the escalation that we see in this week? Like we've got a really good analysis of how it happened, where we are now. What is new and what is repetition?
To add some nuance, I replied to Daan, and Daan said, it looks like it might be war. And I said, well, what makes it, why is this day special? And instead of all the other days, for me, it looks like business as usual, to put it cynically. But maybe it isn't business as usual. Maybe this is a unique situation. So my question to add to Daan is or isn't it a unique situation we look at right now?
Great question. I would say, let's not get hung up on the question of is it war or not. That's a semantic question, which I don't think is so central. But what is important is that this is, again, I've lost count, but there have been a number of these outbreaks, mini wars, episodes, conflicts, whatever anyone wants to call them. Or again, and language is important because Palestinians would just call it an assault on Gaza, but whatever you want to call it, there have been a number, they sort of happen every sort of 3, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, but there's been like 4 or 5 of them in the last sort of 12, 15 years. And don't quote me on the numbers, but there have been a number of them. And what happens, as I said, there's some sort of trigger, rockets are fired, Israel hits lots of Hamas targets, civilians die, most of the dead are always on the Palestinian side, the fighting ends, and nothing fundamentally changes. Hamas still control Gaza, Israel still controls the sort of way in and the way out. No concessions made by either side. Everyone, prepares their forces for another round, which breaks out. So in that sense, I do not think that this round is any different in this case. Israel is not going to invade Gaza. And the Palestinians are not going to be able to defeat Israel. But there are a number of subtle differences that I think are important. Number one, the sort of macabre battle over the casualties is not as center field as it normally is. Now, a number of civilians have clearly died. Vast majority. I think so far about a total of 120 people have died. About 111 on the Palestinian side in Gaza, and about 7 or 8 in Israel. And I'm not including, by the way, as we speak, there are rumors that Israel basically tricked Hamas into thinking it was going to do a ground invasion, and lots of the troops, the Hamas fighters, went into the tunnels and that was bombed. That's a rumor that's going round, and which possibly means that hundreds of Hamas fighters were killed. But again, I don't know. That there's strong stories coming out about it. But let's leave that to one side. So we're looking at, and then the question is, and again, it is macabre. Okay, it is a horrible thing that happens. But normally, what happens is there's a fight over who died. Were they really civilians? Were they Hamas fighters? Were they the children who died? Were they killed by Israeli in bombing range, or was it a Hamas work accident? In other words, a rocket which didn't fire properly and ended up killing Palestinians. And
Alex?
there's normally that is yes. Let me finish this point, Kai. Let me finish this point first. And that is normally at the center of the war of narratives, particularly in outside of Israel Palestine. But it hasn't been essential this time. Hamas have not put it front and center because they see themselves as showing their power to attack Israel. So on Monday night, there was just a massive bombardment of hundreds of rockets over Tel Aviv, and there's been footage going round of it. And that is the image that Hamas, for its own reasons, has wanted to present of sort of Palestinian strength, rather than the sort of the weakness, if you like, that comes from presenting the Palestinian victims.
Alex, another side or arena to this conflict that I think I would like to hear maybe you describe a little bit is the insurgencies, the riots, the what's going on in the mixed cities within the Israeli state. So when I say mixed cities, I mean cities who for the past 60 years are populated with both Arab citizens and Arab Palestinian citizens and Israeli Jewish citizens. And I'm also curious in asking, do you think that is maybe not extraordinary because it happened before, but we haven't seen this reality for a while? So how does that play a part in the uniqueness of the situation?
Okay. Great question. So first of all, terminology. There's probably someone listening who's really upset by the words I'm using. That's fine. Everyone has different words and different terms, and I try wherever possible to use all the different terms. Okay. Even the term mixed city is slightly misleading, but to give some background for people who aren't so familiar with all this. After 1948, we said that 50,000 Palestinians become refugees, but the remainder, about 150,000 people, become citizens of the state of Israel. They get called Israeli Arabs, but really they're Palestinians. They're part of the Palestinian people, and they live under military rule until 1966. And then after 1966, the military rule is dropped, but their place in Israeli society is as a minority that, although they are definitely, in terms of officially, they can vote in elections, they have politicians in the Knesset, there's no restrictions on jobs, where they live, etc., etc. But in all sorts of ways, they have been discriminated against. Some of those things have been addressed to varying degrees at different points in time. In recent years, for example, there's been huge investment in the Israeli Arab community, but definitely, and again, no one would disagree with this. Even a right wing Israeli Zionist would agree that they face discrimination and problems as a result. And obviously, they're caught in between two communities, that they're Israeli citizens. They're Israeli citizens, but they're part of the Palestinian people. So they're sort of caught in two worlds in that sense. And this week, as a result of what's happening in Jerusalem with Al-Aqsa, and then with Gaza, they began to first of all protest, but it very quickly turned much more violent. And in the city of Lod, which is what we call a mixed city, but it's actually majority Jewish, but prior to 1948 was a almost exclusively Palestinian city. Huge number of refugees. Lod was one of the places where Palestinians were expelled in 1948. And today, again, I'm not sure of exactly the population mix. I'd have thought it's about 70% Jewish, 80% Jewish, probably about 20-30% Arab. There were riots that involved synagogues were burned and attacked, and an Arab man was shot and killed by a Jew who claimed in self-defense. And there was a whole host of violent acts. And then the following day, this spread to lynchings of Arabs, lynchings of Jews, and all over the country. This has spread to the mixed towns all over the country, and not just the mixed towns. There are areas where I wouldn't pass through right now because I think it would be dangerous. I have a friend who owns a boutique hotel in a city called Akko, which has been basically just, terribly vandalized. Arab shop owners have experienced similar things. So, and this is actually quite unprecedented. That it's true that there have been moments of tension, but nothing. This is sectarian violence, which the likes of which we haven't seen. And again, there's a war of narratives. Again, I think it's important to be really open, that no one hides anything. One side sees this as a sort of, even if the violence is unfortunate, it's a kind of legitimate, it's the Palestinians joining in solidarity with their brothers in Gaza, whereas the Israeli Jewish population sees synagogues being destroyed and other acts like that. And, there's nothing. And when a Jew sees a synagogue being destroyed, that isn't the way he's never going to get the message you want from, or maybe he is. If the message is that you hate them, then he's going to get that message. But he's certainly not going to get the message of, oh, these people are facing legitimate problems that we need to address. And that's why I think this is a real crisis for relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel, even if it's important to emphasize that a vast majority of people aren't involved in these acts. There have been stories of Arabs helping Jews, protecting them. The boutique hotel in Akko was protected by an Arab family for as long as they could until the mob was just too powerful, and Jews have been helping Arabs. So in other words, you must not think that Jews and Arabs are just all at each other's throats. But as we know, a small minority can cause really terrible damage.
So I guess now we can go back to the first topic we addressed.
Yeah.
And that is the Western pro-Palestinian response to the violence, saying it's not a conflict because a conflict needs to have two equal parties. So it's a very easy conflict, they say, because it's just the violence of the state of Israel. It's state violence and it needs to be undone, right? That's how I would paraphrase it. How would you answer this question?
Right. Well, I think the way it is, the way events are presented in mainstream European left-wing discourse is really it's a battle between good and evil. And I presented before the idea, I talked about this idea of Israel as a settler colonial or an apartheid state. Human Rights Watch, and by the way, an Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, has officially called Israel an apartheid state. But I would argue that these words, these terms, are really stand-ins for the word evil.
Yeah, it's very simple, right? Like the simplification. It's actually it's used ever since the Second World War ended, right? The Nazis are evil, and the Jewish people are the good people, and the people in the resistance are the good people, and the people working with the Germans are the bad people. So there's a division between good and evil.
I would be careful. Yeah, first of all, I don't think the idea of good and evil goes back to the Second World War. It goes back to the earliest stories humans tell ourselves.
No, wait a second.
Yeah,
wait a second.
Yeah, go on.
No, I refer to, well, actually, ever since the Second World War, it is in mainstream culture, you have this very, very simple good and evil narrative.
Yeah.
That's why
Okay.
in the mainstream culture, in art and in culture, you see this development.
Right.
That's what I meant. Sorry.
Right. That's partly it. But that's partly it. But my primary issue here with the way these terms are used is not that I don't think that we can use the word settler colonial or apartheid as terms that can describe aspects of Israeli policy or Zionist ideology. I do think.
And why? Can you work this
aspects, out? Why can you use those terms?
Yes.
Yeah. Well. For example, the Zionist movement, its sort of methodology was similar to other settler colonial entities. In other words, it came to a land that had people living there, and it did take over territory and build walls and defend itself and discriminated against the people living there. I don't deny those things. However, what needs to be understood, there's two aspects. This is a good way. Let's the settler colonial aspect, because let's take that first, and then we'll talk about the apartheid aspect. So there are settler colonial aspects of the Zionist movement, but there are other aspects as well that you do not hear about in mainstream left-wing discourse. In other words, the national liberation aspect is not talked about, and the fact that Jews originate from the land of Israel. Either what became Palestine, either this is dismissed as some sort of myth, even though it's not a myth, it's, a clear historical fact, or it's dismissed as totally irrelevant. So, 2,000 years ago, long time ago, it doesn't matter, it's completely irrelevant. To which the answer is it's not completely irrelevant, because the very reason for political Zionism was the diagnosis that the primary cause of anti-Semitism was Jews not having a homeland, that Jews had been forced into exile and had to wander around countries where sometimes they did well, sometimes they didn't, but they were always having to rely on being treated well by the Gentiles, by the non-Jews. And that's great when things are good, and there are lots of good times in Jewish history, but when it's not good, you are in big trouble.
Would you call that, Alex, would you call that the myth of wandering, the myth of the wandering Jew?
Why? The myth in what sense?
Well, you say that the understanding of anti-Semitism, if I paraphrase you well, is really defined on the fact that the concept, the idea that the Jews didn't have a home, that they were always visitors or nomads or travelers within Europe. So then the story of the diaspora as an identity marker, like we are the wandering ones, is crucial here.
Right.
Whereas the creation of a state of Israel also denies that whole history, because then all of a sudden the Jews are not wandering anymore. So their whole raison d'être has been
Well, look, I think there's a clash here that essentially on the left you see that this idea of the sort of powerless, noble, wandering Jew who's meant to be a sort of light into the nations and be very progressive and very left-wing from European societies, right? In other words, the Jew the response to anti-Semitism isn't to say, I'm going to build my own state and I'm going to defend myself. I'm going to use the words of Malcolm X, I'm going to protect my people by any means necessary. In other words, the Jew needs to stay where they are and fight racism. Okay? The Jew needs to stay where they are and fight racism as part of a wider left-wing collective, whereas the Zionist response is we need to protect our people by any means necessary. And the best way you do that in the modern world is by forming your own state. And obviously we're going to form our own state in the land where we originally, before we were dispersed by Gentile violence, where we began. So that's a very, very critical dichotomy in how the two sides view and that Zionist narrative just isn't talked about. It's just ignored on the mainstream European left, or at best it's like, oh, that's really unfortunate, but that doesn't justify in any way Zionism. It's just a really unfortunate thing, but you should just, you should stay and just fight racism wherever you are, and we'll help you at best. In other words, I don't think, and this will be controversial to some people, I don't think that sort of anti-Zionism I don't think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic in the sense that I don't think anti-Zionists object to the existence of Jews, but what they want is Jews to be a minority. The Jews should be a minority, and they should be sort of kept safe by the wider world. And this ties into the very important, we haven't talked about it much, the Middle East. There is this myth that prior to Zionism, Jews lived wonderfully in the Middle East amongst Muslim rulers, and that Zionism ruined everything. And it's a myth, it's a lie, it's literally a lie. That isn't to say that Jews didn't have great times in the Middle East. They did. It's not to say that Jews didn't contribute. It's not to say that Jews didn't contribute a lot to Middle Eastern culture, to the culture of the Arab world. They did. It's also not to say that it was worse in the Arab world, the Muslim world, than it was in Christian Europe, because it wasn't. It was better, I think, in those places. But again, they were reliant on the goodwill of people who saw them as inferior. Muslims literally saw Jews as inferior, and this is what, by the way, one of the things which contributes to the conflict is that it's not just the humiliation of being the victim of this sort of settler colonial movement. It's Jews who are doing it, and Jews in Islamic culture are historically inferior. And again, I want to emphasize, I really deeply believe in the possibility of Jewish-Muslim conciliation. And there's definitely not all Muslims who see the world in this way, but we will not be able to reconcile if we do not acknowledge the truth of that, because it plays an important role today. It helps explain the nature of the violence in places like Lod.
Alex,
Yeah.
I was curious, and I'm going a little bit more personal here. So if I put to light sort of the stitching point where I am, then I'm an Israeli and I live in the Netherlands, and I'm interested in culture and I'm interested in religion, and now I myself find myself being really helpless in trying to explain that complexity which you now claim that is unseen by the European public and in general by the world public on the issue of Israel Palestine. And I'm curious, in a sense we are just opposite from each other, right? So you moved from England to Israel, and I've stepped out from Israel, but we're both in a sense struggling to mirror the complexity of the situation. So what is your weapon? How are you able, or what are you trying to use in order to explain that complexity, that multi-layer nature of the thing?
Great question. Well, first of all, look, in my work as a tour guide and educator, at least prior to Corona, this was sort of my day job. You know, obviously I'm telling people about historical sites, but a big part of it is talking about the conflict. And I work a lot with a great organization called Mejdi Tours, which do dual narrative tours of Israelis and Palestinians. And that's been a particularly really important place for me to sort of develop my ideas and thinking. Now, in terms of the question of engaging with a wider audience, I'm not active on social media. And I was talking about this before with Daan, that I've come to the realization there are people whose minds I can't change. I used to think that I make a point, I try to be truthful, and there's a give and take. That someone says, actually, I never thought you're right about that point, and I'm going to modify my view as a result. And then maybe someone else will say something, and that's going to lead to me modifying my view. That's how I try to interact with the world. But I realize that when it comes to the question of Israel Palestine, this is basically has become an impossibility. Among a lot of Israeli Jews, it's become an impossibility. And for the purpose, our focus of the discussion today, for a lot of people on the mainstream European left, it is impossible. It does not matter what I say, that it is still just going to be a simple morality tale. And on the one hand, that's very painful, because, what's the point? But then on the other hand, I reached out to do this because I realized that there are people who will listen, and will engage, and I should try to reach them out in a better forum than the hellscape that is something like Twitter, for example. And I don't know who listens to this or to other venues I try to engage with, but I'm sure there are people who really deeply disagree with me. I'm sure there are people who think Israel is a settler colonial state, an apartheid state, or whatever it is. And thinking whatever you want to think is fine. But the question is, are you open to, am I just a monster because I don't agree with you? Am I de facto a racist monster because I'm Israeli? Or is there a possibility of some sort of communication? And, I hope there is, because if there isn't a point of communication, then the future is very bleak.
Yes, I completely agree with you, and I'm really curious as well. To have this more open discussion about the complexities of this situation, without falling into the trap of talking in this good old evil, good and evil narrative.
I want to say about that. I want to just, before you carry on, it's important because you've said the word complexities, and I think the word complex triggers people on Israel Palestine, because people on the pro-Palestinian left hear the word complex and they see that as a way of kind of hiding the truths of Palestinian victimhood, and I think sometimes the word complex is used in that way. Complex can be used as a way to shut down discussion. Complex can be used as a way of saying, you don't really understand this. You know, you think you have this great view, but you don't really understand this. And I think that's a bad way of using complex. But another way of using the term complex is to describe the reality that all of these factors are in play and are dicing around with each other. That yes, there are settler colonialist aspects to Zionism, but it is also a nationalist. It is also a national liberation movement that has been very successful. Yes, the Palestinians have suffered at the hands of Zionism, but yes, they have also taken decisions that weren't the wisest decisions in order to make the situation better, and onwards. And there are sort of dozens of examples of this. And that's what I mean when I talk about complexity. I mean that things which seemingly contradict each other, but they don't contradict each other. We just need to be aware of all of these aspects in order to find a way forward.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, and I think it's a good natural to be continued sort of ending of our conversation. Yeah. So we should definitely talk some more about it. You said at the beginning, no, not in this conversation, but earlier this morning, that we should also have this the same conversation from a Palestinian perspective. So we will definitely do that in the near future.
Can we conclude with a poem?
Yeah,
There's
of course.
There's a poem by Yehuda Amichai. There's a great Jerusalem poet.
Take the stage.
And he has a great... What?
Take the stage.
His poem, I've got an English translation in front of me, and it's called The Place Where We Are Right. It's one of my favorite poems. And it says, from the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plough, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. It's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I wish we speak you soon. So in the second part of this episode, we are going to discuss the conversation we just had with Alex Stein.
I was quite nervous to do this. I mean, I immediately said to you, yes, Michiel, we should do this, but that's... I'm not. It will not be often that I will discuss so publicly about these opinions. Of course, I am emotional about this subject. I am very much involved, and from the openness that Alex sort of expressed, that gave me a lot of relaxation to continue with the discussion over it. I mean,
And why can you explain us why?
Well, because it is a very complex identity. It is the Middle East has a complex identity. The people who live in the Middle East have a complex identity, and then to try to explain that to an audience. Let's say that we're talking about the Netherlands now, is very complicated, and for me to start off from a point where we understand that something needs to change in the discourse. That is a good opening move, because I feel that there's so much baggage on this that nothing goes through in both sides, and Alex also has that sort of doubleness. So he's British, and then he comes as an educator, but he also is a citizen, and then he lives in Israel, and he had himself, and he said it. earlier, moved to Israel as a Zionist. So that for me to see so many levels of gray between that black and white, that is for me a good boost. That's why I want to thank Dan for insisting for sharing, for bringing Alex into the conversation.
Yeah, I said this morning also, I think the more and more I realized that I have an empty head on the whole subject. So the more I hear about it, the less I have to say about it, and I think that is the real knowledge that I'm acquiring here.
Yeah, and as I said, what I'm really interested in is how discourse develops in the Western world, or the cultural world I operate in. So the oversimplification, as I named it. So maybe we can talk a little about it.
Now, maybe I have to say that for me, this is sort of a continuing discussion that we are sort of having ever since we celebrated Hanukkah in an apartment in Amsterdam. So we celebrated Hanukkah. It was us three and also Lara, and we had a very long discussion about the Jewish predicament and about the specific festivity that we are celebrating, and that festivity, that festival of Hanukkah, is meant to commemorate the destruction of the Jewish temple, and so on and so forth, and the miracle that there happened. And from the discussion about that holiday, and from that sort of scene in which we are sitting in Amsterdam with its own sort of history, which is connected to the Jews, we started talking about what is discussed in the Dutch world. What is discussed? What is the discourse? How do we talk about Judaism? How do we talk about World War II? And for me, this is sort of a continuing sort of discussion. And my position in it is that first of all, I'm learning a lot. So I'm learning how I talk. I'm learning how I should explain my identity or how I should be situated in that sort of European discourse. And I'm also learning a lot about what happens in the Dutch media world, what happens in the Dutch political world. So we are sitting. I sort of had my entrance to the cultural sphere of Amsterdam, right? With in the academic world, where I meet people from Daan's milieu, and in the cultural world, where I meet people from Michiel's milieu and from Lara's milieu. And within that, you hear a lot of voices. So first, you hear a lot of, Israelis are very loud. You know, you're always center stage. And now I feel, well, I was pushed to sort of speak about it again because Israel is now center stage in the world.
I remember our first meeting op de Schelling, and then I said, at one point, that talking with Israeli always lead to talking about Israel, right? I remember it.
Yes. So there's
this cliche of Israeli people talking about the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
So we can both agree that there's a lot of talking, but is there talking? That is the question. So are we really saying? Are we really discussing? Are we really making opinions? Or are we hanging on to sort of old opinions, old sort of frameworks which are easy? And I don't have an answer to that. I even don't know if I'm candid enough in my approach. But I was struck to read Daan's essay about the political parties in the Netherlands and their stance about Israel Palestine. So
maybe we have to ask Daan. Daan, can you explain a little about this research?
Now, at the time, there was a parallel between at the same time the Israeli elections and the Dutch elections were happening more or less at the same time, and I think that the irony has been that the situation of the formation of the coalition government in the Netherlands and Israel had become strikingly parallel, actually, in what happened over the past weeks with Mark Rutte and Netanyahu. I wrote an article a few months ago about the role of the imagination of Israel in Dutch political discourse, especially in their party programs, as a result of the caused by the implosion of Forum for Democracy in November, where I realized that in the Netherlands, the question of how we understand these sort of clash of civilization narratives, to speak with Huntington, between either the Christian Judo tradition as it's now being framed in the right wing, and then Islam on the other sense, or other sort of oppositional forces, play a huge part in our imagination of what we understand by pluralist liberalism and who stands at what side. And of course, nobody at that time could expect that this sort of third intifada now would break out as it is happening now. And you also see that in the Netherlands, a political spectrum is actually not that much interest in the case. You see, of course, Geert Wilders having an interest in the case, and you see Sylvana Simons having an interest in the case. And for the rest, in the Netherlands, we're more interested with the toeslagenaffaire and a new political culture. But what I do think is crucial there is that the idea of the imagination of the Holy Land as a sort of the imagination of liberation, also the imagination of a paradise after Earth, is in, like, on the surface we're a very secular country, but under the surface you see how this all these Christian, Jewish and Islam forms play a huge role in how the narrative is shaped. If you listen to Kees van der Staaij, you see this. If you listen to the Christian Union, you see this. But even in political parties who come with a very secularist or even a sort of trade-like narrative, like we should just have trade with Israel, or not have trade or whatever, like GroenLinks or the VVD, then even these sort of dynamics are playing a role. And now we see that this whole battle is magnified. On the other hand, I also think that the Netherlands is when the Netherlands talks about Israel, we're not talking about Israel, but or about the Palestinians, but we're talking about ourselves. So that's also what I feel. If you look at the sort of woke culture, Free Palestine movement, that's also not really about Palestine. It's also about ourselves.
Daan, can you explain what do you mean when you say we're looking at ourselves?
Now, I see, I think what was most instructive about what we hear about from Alex is that you see a very detailed, minute, political, real situation, with a sort of grain of reality that we're not really used to, because Israel is something in our minds in a certain sense. It is also, maybe it is the primordial conflict in a certain sense. So it is soul crushing. What we see is also soul crushing. So the reactions are also the exclamation of a soul being crushed, where Alex says, "Oh, I find it so sad that I haven't been that it's just impossible to bring across my point, even if people are confronted with the facts." In one conversation I had recently, what came up is the idea that Israel is really not about, and Palestine is not about facts. It's about trying to find a voice for being suppressed. It's a scream. It's a primordial scream. So for me, I see the reaction either where you are stand with Israel or hashtag, or where you are with the hashtag Gaza is suffering. Those are primordial screams. And especially because we have the social media now, these screams become magnified, and through TikTok they also become postmodernized. And that leaves us with a sort of echo chamber of wah, and that is because Israel, let's take the Al-Aqsa Mosque, let's take the Wailing Wall, that is really at the core of how identity, ethnicity, belonging, and religious imagination is formed. So the secular story that this is all about politics or settler colonialism, which is one level to look at it. That's the material component of colonial capitalism and the suppression that comes with it. That is the material expression of this deeper sort of psychoanalytical Freudian expression of suffering and the soul-crushingness of these events.
Okay, but what I'm coming back to your analysis, and it was a very elaborate analysis of the different political parties in the Netherlands, which I've studied quite hard in the last election to sort of understand what is the political reality which I'm in. And what was for me striking is that apart from quite, let's say, a bit esoteric Christian parties and the extra radical left, the rest of the parties in the Netherlands, so the rest of the Dutch politics, is quite careful in even talking about it. And that's a reality that has changed. So in the 90s, Michiel says it himself, that in the 90s there was this incentive to react to the reality in the Middle East. And now, at least from my experience, it's a sort of voorzichtigheid. It's a very careful atmosphere in which everyone's a little bit scared to touch it because we are Jews and the Second World War and then the history of the Second World War. And in the other sense, everyone is very liberal, so we want to talk about oppression when we want to come out of it. So my question is, now we have for 3 days we have people TikToking, people Instagramming, people. Are these reactions coming only from woke culture? Are they coming only from extreme sort of left? Or are they also now coming from all the silent middle people that are now saying, oh, now it's the time to talk about Palestine and Israel. Now there's an intifada, I have to now react. That is a question, I don't know. Because it would be interesting if it's a wider public that is waking up right now. That means, because that will mean that the woke has a leverage, that the woke has a sort of is on a wave.
Yeah, as I see it, I always look at what is the recent trauma. So for the Dutch, it's the Second World War. For the Jewish people, it's also the Second World War. And there's a similarity and a difference. So the similarity is that it's both, for both sides, it's traumatizing. But for the Jewish people, it's, well, the Jewish people are suffering because there was an attempt to wipe them out. And for the Dutch, well, there were Jewish people, so they also got involved. And then there are Dutch people who did this, who delivered the basis infrastructure to do it. So there's a feeling of guilt, and there's a feeling of how do we deal with it. So I think the first response to the Israeli situation is, okay, so we understand the suffering of the Jewish people, and so we understand the need for international solution. So we understand the state of Israel and why you need a solution in form of a new state. So I think the first proper response for the Western world is, okay, we understand it. We try to do this. Let's do this. Let's try to find a solution. And then we have the Palestinian problem, and then we try to make this two-state solution. Like, okay, so we divide this sacred land, this ancient land, into two separate parts. And, well, ancient history shows us that both of you can make a claim that this is your land. So, well, let's treat you as two little children and with one cookie. So break the cookie in two and both have a half cookie. Well, enjoy the land, you know. So and that's part of the world narrative with America and the first world. We build the world and we build a better world. So in the 90s we have this narrative like this ideal that the world was almost finished, and this was where new stories pop up. Like, well, it's not that easy because there's the Palestinian suffering. So that's the second step. And now what we now see, that the woke culture is actually looking at another recent trauma. That's the transatlantic slave industry. So that's their trauma. So they have other starting points. They say, yeah, okay, the Holocaust is only 6 years of suffering. So now it becomes really mathematical. It's 6 years of suffering. Well, we suffered for 300 years. So there's the power play of suffering, you know? And then the woke culture says, okay, so our suffering is due to transatlantic slave industry, and that's due to the globalization and the how do you say, the colonization of lands. So and then it gets then it's really blurry. But I think the simplification will be, okay, so making states is already problematic in this sense that we have the colonization and then we have the states, the born of the sovereign state, and that's already a problem because of the violence towards us, the slaves of this industry. So then they use this as an oversimplification to look at Palestinians, and they say, okay, this is also suffering from a state, and okay, the Jewish people are also suffering, and the Palestinians are also suffering, but the problem is states are problematic because of they create human suffering. So that's in my view the oversimplification of the problem, and that's how I see woke culture responding. Palestinian suffering is the problem right now, so we have to get rid of the state of Israel.
Yeah, and that is where we get to sort of to the oversimplification that Alex was talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we are busy in comparing and not busy in really going to a deeper level of discussion and a deeper level of real problem solving, because most of the European states, also the US, and both, let's say, for argument's sake, sides of the discussion within the Levant or within the current state of Israel, we almost now all agree that that we are not able to keep the cookie whole, that we cannot keep the cookie whole, but we also almost agree that we cannot split the cookie and stay happy. So we are really looking for a practical solution, and oversimplifying it to just suffering is just not going to create any solution, and we're not going to get any wiser in it as well.
Yeah, I was actually, I should have asked this to Alex, but maybe we can do it, or you can try to answer. That I was wondering why he thinks the West is ignoring, for example, these two things he said about like Judea being the original country and Zionist also being a safe haven for Jewish people in Europe that have no land. And I was wondering why he thinks the West ignores that or doesn't take that in account.
Now, I cannot answer the question directly, but it comes back to how Alex, I think, started his whole explanation by saying a lot of the discussion is about where you put in the bookmark as your starting point. Like, do you start in 67? Do you start in 48, 47, in 29, 21, or in the 7th century, right? And it is... I'm not sure if you can put it as black and white in the sense of why does the West ignore this? I think when I went to Israel myself, what I realized very quickly in traveling around, and then I say Israel, but I just mean the southern Levant, because I've been in places as various as Tiberias, Nablus, Bethlehem, Tel Aviv, and Haria, like really various places, that you don't have to travel very far, and then the soil, like the earth, literally the earth, will start telling you a new narrative. So Alex was explaining very clearly about Damascus Gate and how the fact that Damascus Gate, which separates East Jerusalem from the old city of Jerusalem, we know old city of Jerusalem is under UN control, East Jerusalem is like B-zone, West Bank, and as soon as there's a barrier being put between those two by the Israeli army, that has a huge symbolic effect. And that is because all these lines in the sand, because let's face it, the Southern Levant is a desert, creates all these different sort of stories about being here, being there, crossing the Rubicon, crossing the Sinai, taking back the Sinai, coming from the Sinai, coming from Saudi Arabia. You have the Arabian conquest, the 7th century colonialism of the Muhammad movement, you could say, which is another way of telling another story about the place, all coming together in this eye of Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, coming together also with the place where Jesus was supposed to be crucified and resurrected, because that's also there in the center of the old city, is the grave of Jesus Christ, right, where he supposedly resurrected. I mean, how symbolic can you have it? And there's even a Protestant place for the resurrection of Jesus and a non-Protestant place for the resurrection of Jesus. So even on that level, these things are split. And then you start seeing that the layers of narratives go so deep. And again, that's not to say the situation is complex. The situation is that there is a narrative gravity to that soil, which is again soul crushing, because you can tell any origin myth you want on any square centimeter of that land. And that is where, as soon as you move, different stories are emerging and popping up. You have Bedouin stories, you have Coptic stories, you have Armenian stories. You of course have a Palestinian liberation story, which is very big. You have a Zionist story. You have a sort of secular hippie story. You have Orthodox Jews who are against the state of Israel because they see it as a way of finishing the Jewish project, which is not allowed because it should never happen. So they are like Orthodox Jews who protest with the Palestinians against the state of Israel. And then at a certain moment you see that the gravity, the narrative gravity and the stories, because it's all about stories. It's all about words, right? It's all about telling stories, repeating stories, creating new stories, creating new historical moments, which then become part of the canon from these different perspectives, which make it so complex.
That's a beautiful way of looking at the ancient history of the soil of the land we're talking about, and then you see this multi-layered narratives. So maybe we can end our conversation with looking at how these stories now are being put on for instance, social media, or in the news, or in the NOS, or in the Volkskrant, or you know, maybe Daan, you want to add something about that as well?
You see a rise on many different topics about a decreasing trust in the information spread by journalist media and governments. So we're losing a sense of quality of information, and you see that especially in the really strong attacks on media such as CNN or the New York Times or the Guardian, which used to be a sort of point of reference where you could sort of rely on. But the narrative on the left and on the right has been increasingly that we cannot trust the MSM or something like that, or the mainstream media. So the postmodernism, in the sense that there is no shared narrative anymore, has advanced even much more than we could even imagine 40 or 50 years ago. And then what is left is sort of all these particular moments of knowledge and information. Like I was talking with Alex on WhatsApp yesterday about his sort of lament for the fact that facts and truth don't matter anymore. And I replied to him that I think it's precisely the desire for truth and facts which doesn't allow you to see that quality is defined by fallibility. Like, it's not people who are courageous enough to make mistakes. That are the people you should rely on. And so I am very concerned with the attacks on what we call the mainstream media or governments, because I think that especially in liberal democracies, these institutions have shown us that they dare to be fallible. And then just pointing out their mistakes as showing, you see, they're wrong, I find that the dangerous moment here.
In principle, the pervasive doubting movement that we see going around, I do agree with you, Dan, that there is an element of danger to it. However, when looking at the reality of politics in the Middle East, especially over the last 15 years, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, I have to say that we have to be really, really, really careful that we can still trust those media institutions that you're talking about. So if I'm contexting what I'm saying now, I'm adding a sort of, again, the layer of politics into the crisis in the Middle East, is that we are also talking about a vacuum of leadership, both for the Gaza side and both for the Israeli side, in which we have these mega, I would even say authoritarian almost leaders. And as we speak, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to protect his staying in power, because he is because one of the cases in which he's being taken to court with is controlling the media, is controlling a very large media network, or yeah. So I think we do need in the context of the Middle East to do have these doubts, but the question is whether we should have them in a sort of very general idea that nothing can be trusted, or we should just be extra careful about the information that we get. Just yesterday, we had this incident where the whole world thought that Israel went into Gaza by foot, the whole world, where in the end we found out that was maybe it was deceiving, or maybe it was just a mistake. But Michiel, you wanted to react to that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a problem with mainstream media. It's not, I won't say that it's completely the end of mainstream media, although I think we're near the end. But I think the problem with mainstream media is that they are not morally invested in their subjects. They're mostly driven by other needs. For instance, making money. So yeah, you could easily see it when it came to for instance, Pieter Omtzigt. He disappeared for a week, and he was under a lot of pressure and fire. And then he had his first public appearance, and then you saw 20 or 30 media outlets storming in, not considering his personal situation, although a kid could understand that this was not the way to treat Omtzigt in that situation. Well, it's just a minor example, but that's how I see media, as vultures in a way, trying to picking in on the news. And that's what we saw yesterday with the news of Israel going into the Gaza Strip. It's like, okay, NOS says, okay, this might be happening. Well, they don't know, but they just wanted the scoop. You see, they just wanted the scoop. And the scoop is not, nobody is interested in the scoop. We are now 24 hours later. We have all the time we need to discuss the topic in all the nuances we want. And I think that's better than the mainstream media. And you see the mainstream media, they really, really want to well, they have been in power for so long, and they lose their power, and they want to grasp the power, and they want to be involved. And yeah, so that's why I think mainstream media is part of the problem. I really do.
Yeah, you know, yesterday, for example, the past 4 days, me and Dan were basically on a endless live stream of the streets of Tel Aviv, and as much as we can the streets of Gaza, but there's not a lot of footage, there's not a lot of image. And the correct me if I'm wrong, but seeing it, the photos you've seen, basically, like the just ongoing footage, mainly coming from TikTok, from Instagram, from people sending stuff in, that was better than any caption. A caption you cannot explain in words. You cannot narrate the reality in a sort of in the traditional caption. And with that, I agree with you. With that comes back again to the sort of oversimplification of the narrative, oversimplification of the idea, and maybe
Yeah. So I remember yesterday we were watching at a video from Kate Sina from Kirak, the topic of last week, and she said, well, we have had 20 years of nihilism, and then I actually believed for this period that it was my fault, that I didn't believe in anything at all. And now I'm older and I see, no, it's not my fault. It's the fault of the mainstream narratives, and I do believe in something, and I have a strong feeling as well. I do believe in meaning, and I do believe in art, and I do believe in beauty, and I think now it's time to come in action and actually make your point, because we have multiple ways to easily tell good stories. And so I think that's the actual cultural revolution we're in when it comes to storytelling. And so what happens in Israel, that's the actual political conflict. So that's the actual world and the problems. But then we have immediately the rippling effect of all the narratives. It's an explosion of narrative. And the narrative is in the realm of the cultural sphere as well. So that's our responsibility, to tell the good version of the nuanced stories. So that's, I think, why I'm so interested in this topic.
And then I agree, and I think then if you go, by the way, to the TikTok, to the Instagram, to the WhatsApp of the past few days, there you see a real generation very bluntly talking about the problems. So we were talking about in the morning, you and I, Michiel, were talking about these sort of waves, quite similar to how Bitcoin works, in which there's eruptions of different things. You can take that example for everything in life, but I see these eruptions as completely natural, and maybe we are, in that sense, maybe I am happy for TikTok, because, well, the reality is there, right? So if that generation, for example, of Arab Palestinians who are now 19, 18, they don't remember they don't know a lot of the historical details that we were discussing here before with Alex, but they are expressing something. And it is very, 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 very sharp. And the reaction that we see from Jewish Israeli side is also, in a sense, very, very sharp. And it's unmediated. And that is quite fascinating. It's unmediated. Even from Gaza, right? There are basically almost no foreign media now in Gaza, sort of bringing the situation out to the world. And what we do get is TikTok films, and that is exactly the opposite of the official Hamas propaganda, which are showing us all sorts of imaginative realities. So yeah, it is. So the sort of, I agree that the off the record, the sort of anarchist forms of media are something new in this sort of conflict that we are looking at right now in the Levant in 2021?
Look, I'm a cultural optimist. I'm not a cultural pessimist. I'm not. I don't see myself in the tradition of Kulturkritik or something like that. So I'm a perpetual pathological optimist about cultural developments. The only thing I see that we might be losing is a courage to be comfortable with uncertainty. And like I say, that loss of courage is, I think, the challenge of our times. And I'm very confident that we will find a way to find new cultural patterns to deal with that loss in courage. But I think that is the sort of confrontation that is happening now in the political media realm.
Can you explain this loss in courage? Can you explain what you mean?
Now, you see that if you want to put it in left and right terms, I feel that the woke left and the new right are very much in agreement when it comes to their faith in truth. So what they both have given up, because they feel an urge to express what they need to express, is a courage to be comfortable with uncertainty. And that is, for me, the real thing what is happening. Because all those positions need each other and mirror each other in their confrontation with each other.
I have another question then, Daan. But would you say that the new right and the woke left, or I don't remember how you put it exactly, are they now not comfortable with our uncertainty? Or so what is new? Was the old extreme left and the extreme right more comfortable with uncertainty than now? Because you're pointing at a change, and I'm finding it currently hard to see.
Well, the change is, I think, that truth is back on the table, and it has become legitimate again to make a claim for that. And that we had, and there I am a bit cultural critical, I thought we had to overcome that. I thought that truth, we all understood that it was not about that, right? And what we call the postmodern moment. Whereas the new modernist moment says that the left and the right, or any position you like, is morally obliged to make a claim for truth and beauty and stuff like that. And that is what I see happening on a lot of sides.
Yeah, but truth is is in a way a problematic concept, because as far as I can see it, people identify with a concept of themselves, and so they go all in with this concept, and they consider that as truth. Whereas I consider truth this multi-layered world with all its narratives colliding and interacting with each other, and you have to navigate it in a way that gives meaning to your own life on a very simple, basic level, and that's very, very difficult to do. So that if you succeed on that level, you're already very far in giving meaning to your personal life, and then I think from that on you can do more and more to do something with your life or with the world. And what I see all around is this attempt to change the world on a very simplistic level, and that's, I guess that's in a way a problem. So then you misuse what truth really is. So you say, my truth is truth. So for instance, this Palestinian suffering.
Which is real. I mean, you
Yeah.
acknowledge it. You do acknowledge that.
Yeah, of course it's real. But it's real because life is suffering in a way. And of course we can look at the specific situation of the Palestinian suffering. But if you go online and you say, it's not a conflict because it's simple, because it's the state of Israel and it has to stop, and it's Palestinian suffering. And if we just put that online, we make a big statement. I think that's really a problem because it's a simplification. Okay, is there any more question or thing you like to add?
No, I think what is really important is we are now Friday morning, just after Eid al-Fitr and just after the Ascension Day, and
Shavuot is coming up as well.
and yes, and also the new Chinese season for the autumn summer harvest. But the situation is currently really explosive and sad, and that is the background in which all these reflections were being produced. But it's important to notice how soul crushing all the news which is coming in all the time is.
Yeah.
I will also end with some optimism, relating to Daan's optimism as well, saying that we covered a lot of the conflict, but I'm very hopeful for a sort of Bitcoin reality exit state in which we see that green line from above and that red line from the bottom, and a sort of figure, maybe something like a Rabin, or maybe something like a new, or someone to sort of to be able to negotiate all these realities that we talked about, all these truths to something different.